What's going on, everyone? So today is October 13th, which means all of the planetary qualifiers for October 12th have gone ahead and finished, and we got the results for it. That means that there's another top eight tournaments, so 64 total top eights that we're going to talk about. There's still some going on today, which I'm sure I will update either in the next couple days or potentially next week. We're going to see if anything has shifted or if the meta continues to kind of show itself as a Boba dominant meta. Now, there are a lot of things to talk about today, so I've gone ahead and started making my own little spreadsheet just to keep track of each week so we can kind of compare the results. So before we get started, big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. We got in a ton of games yesterday, really quite fun, and also had a lot of conversation, talked about our new playmats, which was fun as well. Also, I have a TCG player link in the description down below. Be sure to use it for all your Star Wars card needs. Let's talk week 1 and week 2. So as I said, I got a little bit of a spreadsheet here that I've been keeping track of all the results for the planetary qualifiers top 8s, and I made them into a little stacked column chart for you all. So week 1 saw us have a ton of Boba Fett's. It was around 40% of the meta, and you can see kind of the second place coming up is Sabine, and she was around 20% of the meta. And if we look at planetary qualifiers for the week 2, it's no different. It is no different. And you can see Boba Fett absolutely dominating. 30 of the top 8 spots was Boba Fett decks. 30 of them. That's absolutely insane. And just to keep in mind, this is not just Boba Green. It's not just Boba Yellow. There's also a decent chunk of Boba Reds and Boba Blues in these top 8s. I guess Boba Blue being the less of the two, but Boba Red actually sporting enough top 8s to kind of be, if you were to separate all the different base and leader combinations, he is up there as like a top 5 finisher, which is absolutely absurd to think about. So nothing really is crazy different. There's a lot of kind of one-ofs at the bottom. In terms of week 1, there's a couple of them that I hadn't mentioned because the tournaments hadn't finished. We had a Gar Yellow and a Kylo Yellow entering into the top 8s. And then in week 2, we also had like another Kylo Yellow, a Cad Bane Blue, and a Tarkin Yellow. These are kind of typically tier 2 decks that people are confident on, bring to the table, and end up performing very well. Our tier 1.5s seem to be very similar. We have Rey, 2 Han, so new Han, OG Han, Boss, Kira kind of in that 3rd through 7th spot in terms of wins. And you can see that's very consistent. We have Boss, Rey, new and old Han, and Kira. Although OG Han does usually have, and new Han usually have a little bit better results than the other two. But in general, these are kind of the tier 1.5 or tier 1 decks. And then you could call Sabine part of that tier 1.5 or maybe tier 0, in that these decks just absolutely dominate every single tournament that they're in terms of popularity, but also entrances to the top 8 and also results in the top 8. If you look at the actual wins here of the planetary qualifiers in week 1, we had 7 total. So 56 top 8s. Here we had, well, 8 total actually, top 8s to talk about, or planetary qualifiers to talk about. There's still, as I said, I think 3 or 4 going on today, so this will expand as of next week. And oh wait, hold on, let me just adjust that. So we had 8 total winners, 3 of them being Boba Green, same as week 1, 1 of them being a Boba Blue, 1 of them being Boba Yellow, 1 of them being Sabine Green, 1 of them being Boss Blue, and 1 of them being Rey Red. So we had a pretty interesting split in terms of winners, but a clear dominant performance from Boba Fett yet again. And I want to double back on this and just mention this yet again, because it's not like this is just a 1 week type thing, or even like it's just Boba Green type thing. Oh, Boba just works really well with Vaders and Mauls. Like there's all the powerful cards in Command Villainy, which has tended to be the kind of, I guess, statement. It's not just Energy Conversion Lab, because basically all of the Boba Greens that we're seeing in top 8 aren't Energy Conversion Lab, Sabine being the major contender for kind of the decks that's bringing Energy Conversion Lab to the field. Really, there's not a lot of unique bases. It's just aspects. Like we don't see a ton of Tarkin Town. It's going to be from Rey Red. We don't see like Jeddah City anywhere besides like Kylo decks. We don't see a Security Complex in any spot. So really the only deck that's bringing a separate base is Rey and Sabine in Tarkin Town Energy Conversion Lab. This is just the strength of Boba Fett. This is just the strength of Boba Fett. And that is something that you have to acknowledge, because it's not just Boba Green. It's not just Boba Yellow. It's not Cunning. It's not Mauls or Vaders. There's Boba Reds and Boba Blues in the top 8 both weeks. And in Boba Red's case, 5 players ended up top 8ing. And if we compare to kind of the leaders, that would put it solidly in the 4th position in terms of best leaders performing from the planetary qualifiers. In terms of week 1, that would have put it in as the, 5th best leader performing in the top 8. If you were to separate by base in its entirety, once again, it would still be in a little bit weaker, I think like 6th or 7th slot, because of Boba Yellow being separate from Boba Green. But this is a massive showing from Boba Fett yet again. This is 30 of the top 64 decks. This is almost 50% of the meta. It would be 32, meaning that it'd be 50%, but this ends up being somewhere around 47, 48% of the meta dominated by Boba Fett. Sabine coming in at 9 decks in the top 8s, which means that she's looking a lot weaker on the meta comparatively to Boba Fett. Basically 1/3 as proliferate, which still puts her somewhere around like 15% of the total meta, which is kind of crazy, because 15% of the total meta in other card games would still be considered a dominant deck, and it still is. But the fact that there's such a disparity between Boba and Sabine not only is due to the continued popularity of Boba Fett, especially since they had such a dominant performance from week 1 Boba Fett, but also just how powerful Boba Fett truly is. And one thing to note is, from week 2, we saw a couple other different decks. We saw different styles pop up. And this is something that I think is determinate from different areas of the world, right? Something that I wanted to mention, we had a couple of US planetary qualifiers in Chicago and Las Vegas. Let me go ahead and see if I can find them on the list. I think we have a kind of little bit of a different interest in terms of decks compared to a lot of the other various countries and various nationalities out there. For example, in United States, Sabine seems to be a deck that really comes to play. We haven't had Rebel Resource, for those of you that know who he is, getting a top 8 spot in the PQ Chicago, as well as Late Night Gaming, Sabine ECL. I believe that's what that means, and I'll have to ask Rebel Resource myself, but that's pretty sweet. Of course, there's still the Boba Fetts, but this was completely dominated by Sabine and Boba Fett, and the same thing kind of goes with the Rochester one. Again, massively dominated by Boba Fett, but we had some Sabine placing the top 8, as well as OG Han Yellows, so that was pretty interesting. But if you look back at the other tournaments, you could basically see maybe occasional 1 to 2 Sabines popping up here and there, but it's not quite as dominant as other tournaments. You see Barcelona, 0 Sabines. France, we have 0 Sabines. In, oh my gosh, I don't even know what flag that is. I'm sorry, guys. Copenhagen, we have 0 Sabines, or 1 Sabine. So very interesting kind of difference between the metas. And I've noticed that Kylo basically never pops up in US tournaments, but we're starting to see it pop up in both the week 1 and week 2 planetary qualifiers due to some random person coming in and he's like, I'm going to play some Kylo Yellow and I'm going to do well with it. So I'm kind of interested in seeing how the meta develops between each country going forward. And we also have a bunch more US planetary qualifiers going on, one in Chaska, one in Leon, we have one in Torino, and we also have one in Las Vegas. And you can see here, there isn't, oh, wait a second. I actually think this just got updated while I'm talking about this. No, I think I did put this. Never mind. Las Vegas was one that I put on the list. I hadn't put this one on because it didn't have a winner quite yet. But you could see another one. Multiple Sabine lists and actually a Sabine winner in Las Vegas. The Torino one has yet to be decided. In Leon, we had Palpatine coming up as a top 8 contender, which I don't have on my list, and a couple other Boba Fett's and New Han and OG Han. And we'll have to see kind of how these develop. Of course, the US wants to take a little bit of time because we're in US time, so we're not separated in terms of time zones. So they haven't had time to actually finish off a lot of their tournaments. But it was very interesting to see all of the decks kind of remain exactly the same. Like, if you look at these, you would basically say the meta has been exactly the same between the 2 weeks. Yes, there's even more of a showing from Boba Fett, but to be honest, this makes sense. If Boba Fett was dominant in week 1, you would have expected more people to bring Boba Fett to week 2 and more people to perform in week 2. And that's exactly what happened. And everything else remained basically the same. Literally the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 slots are the exact same decks, right? We have Sabine, 2 Han, 1 Han, 1 Han, Kira, Bosk, and Rey. Literally the exact same decks. And then we have a bunch of outliers in Kylo, Iden, Gar Saxon, Cad Bane, and Tarkin. All of those are kind of the outliers, but that makes sense because there's only one of them in the top 8s in each week, which means that, again, someone ended up coming in confident with a deck that they're familiar with, and they ended up placing pretty well. So I would say the meta is pretty stable, and there's a clear dominant deck, and that's Boba Fett. I would put Boba Fett in the tier 0 position, and I would put Sabine in the tier 1.5, and then I'd put all the other ones in the tier 1 section. So if there was a tier list, I would put Boba Fett in the double S tier, okay? Boba Fett in his own tier, and ironically, you could even put 2 variants of Boba Fett in this tier. You could put Boba Green and Boba Yellow in this deck, or in this tier, but to be honest, based on the results, it looks like Boba Green is in his tier of his own. And then you have Boba Yellow kind of alongside Sabine Green. And then you have Boba Red and all the other decks, OG Han, New Han, all that stuff in tier 1, which was kind of surprising to me, considering the fact that we hadn't really seen a ton of Boba Red really ever in the coming up to planetary qualifiers. So seeing week 1, I was like, maybe this is just like someone wants to play Boba Red. And they just ended up bringing it because they thought Boba Fett was strong and they performed well, but maybe it was a fluke. It's not a fluke. Week 2, basically the exact same divvying up of Boba Fett decks, and 5 decks making it in the top 8 of Boba Red makes it solidify itself as a very solid contender, because it's still fighting against all the Boba Greens and Boba Yellows out there and the Sabine Greens, so it does pretty well. So the fact that Boba Fett, ironically, to people who are saying that maybe this is just like a one-time thing, it has Boba Green as this clear dominant deck, but also Boba Yellow on the same tier as like a Sabine, and then Boba Red on the same tier as the other decks that are still competing for some top 8 slots. Just goes to show you how powerful that leader truly is. And in terms of actual results winning of the tournaments, 4 of the wins from first week was Boba Fett. 5 of the wins from week 2 were Boba Fett, and that's not all Boba Green. It was Boba Blue, Boba Yellow, and Boba Green all combined together in these wins for Boba Fett. So not only are they coming in force in popularity of the meta, but also they're actually coming in force to the top 8s. But they're also converting those top 8s to wins, right? That is really, really quite impressive. In fact, there almost is an exclusive amount of Boba Fetts as the winners. There is more than 50% of the wins being Boba Fett decks out of these planetary qualifiers. So for anyone who might be saying, okay, maybe it's just the fact that they're popular decks and people want to bring Boba Fett, maybe that's why we're seeing so many Boba Fett decks, doesn't seem to be the case because of them converting not only to top 8s, but also to wins of those top 8s. And they're fighting against all these other fantastic decks in the finishes. And yes, there was actually a decent showing of Bosk Blue. Not crazy, but there was still a couple of decks playing Bosk Blue, which is one of those decks that is pretty good against Boba Fett, generally speaking, both green and yellow. Not sure how the matchup for Boba Red or Boba Blue goes, because I haven't played those ones nearly enough. But in terms of Boba Green and Boba Yellow, control does tend to do well. And we're starting to see a little bit more of it. Maybe that's just because people ended up doing well with Bosk, and that's why we see it in the top 8s. Or perhaps because of the dominant force of Boba Fett, people are starting to bring more control decks. And because the meta is so proliferate of Boba Fett, they just have good matchups, generally speaking, throughout the tournament. We'll have to see as we progress through the extra weeks coming forward. So let me know what you think in the comment section down below, guys. Planetary qualifiers week 1 and week 2 almost in the books, and Boba Fett is showing up. Boba Fett is absolutely showing up. And at this point, I think it's safe to say we won't see anything too crazy change between now and set 3 releasing. Now, we still have 3-4 weeks to go until that happens. So expect more Boba Fett's, expect more Sabines, and expect everyone to complain about Boba Fett for the next time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all for the next one.